So we've been talking about the EU. Let's talk about a couple of things related to how their privacy laws may intersect with ours here in the U.S. You've been talking, Tanya, sort of around the perimeter here about the general data protection regulation that will go into effect in the EU next May. Can you tell us what that is and what we should be looking out for?
Yeah, sure. This is really a huge development, and it's something that is going to cause a lot of change here in this country as well. So the GDPR is a revamp of European privacy law. So the existing privacy law structure in Europe is what's known as the Data Protection Directive. The difference is that a directive is exactly that. It directs the individual member countries to issue their own laws, whereas a regulation is actual EU-wide law. So part of the goal here was to harmonize within Europe. Whether it will actually accomplish that goal is a good question, because there are still many European jurisdictions that deal with privacy much more strictly, like Germany, than other countries. But what it does, interestingly, has an extraterritorial jurisdiction provision, lest any U.S. company thinks that it need not worry about this. It says that even if you're not in Europe, you don't have personnel in Europe, you don't have servers in Europe, but you are processing the data of European data subjects, which is the term they use for people there. You're processing the personal data of data subjects, even if it's just they visited your US website, right? You are drawn into this. You are covered by it. And it does impose things like opt-in obligations in certain situations to use data in unexpected ways. So without getting too much into the weeds, you have to have a legal basis to process any data, personal data. And that would include things like browsing behavior that we've been talking about. And one basis to process the data is consent. Consent in Europe has a very different meaning than consent here in the States. We live in a, by default, fairly opt-out regime here, as we've been talking about. In Europe, it has to be a true opt-in, meaning you have a box that is not checked and you click it. For anyone who's familiar with all the browse wrap versus click wrap cases, think about it that way. Something that actually requires you to affirmatively agree. That's an opt-in. So you can process information when you have an opt-in, and it also has to be very conspicuously disclosed and explained what's going to happen. Now, there are exceptions where, for example, you're using the information for marketing that's contextual, right? Wouldn't be surprising, wouldn't shock a person, because I was visiting a certain website and then that company who I was interacting with is going to use my information to market to me a product I might have been looking for. That kind of thing isn't really, they can probably process your data for that purpose even without an opt-in. But if it's like, it's going to go to some third-party advertiser, the ISP is going to have this very complex relationship with all these third-party organizations for advertising. That would require more under GDPR. And so it will make a change even with respect to some of these things that we've been talking about with FCC, but it's going to make a change more broadly with respect to all processing of employee and consumer data when we're talking about EU data subjects.
Got it. So is it going to work like California's Cal-OPA has worked, where now everyone is going to have to comply for all of their customers with the directives of the GDPR?
Right. So I think that the practical impact is going to be that most companies that find that they are subject to it are going to have to make certain changes that, even if they're not technically required to comply across the board, are in many cases going to do that. So in other words, if you have to put in place certain mechanisms for consent, if you can really divide it up so that you're only doing that for people in Europe, maybe that might be done. But I don't think that in many cases it's not going to be that simple. And operationally, companies are going to need to do things a little bit more expansively. And remember, the GDPR is not just about getting consent. You have to update privacy policies to disclose these things. You have to update your internal policies about data handling and data security. You have to do, if the information involved is highly sensitive or in other situations, you have to do what's called a privacy impact assessment to make sure that you're handling everything appropriately. You have to do employee training. I mean, this goes way beyond just a notice law. It's a total, for companies that don't have a privacy program, they're going to need to have a privacy program. For companies that have a privacy program, they're going to need to make sure that they have updated it to make it consistent with EU standards. This is a general movement towards a much more stringent structure that American companies are going to have a very hard time extricating themselves from. And I will tell you that the big technology companies, they are already working on this very significantly. They're investing a lot of resources to get ready for this, and smaller companies as well, right? But I can assure you that GDPR is probably a top priority for any company that has been focused on privacy issues and has very large volumes of consumer data. They're already working on this, even though we're still a year out.
Right. So you brought up.
So Tanya, sorry, Denise, go ahead. So what are the penalties associated with non-compliance? Are they pretty severe?
They are, and that's actually the thing that's driving a lot of this attention, and that's why thank you for reminding me. So the penalties are up to 4% of global turnover, or 20 million euros. So that's a lot of money.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what occurs to me?
Would this apply? Sorry, go ahead, Denise.
No, you finish up, and then I'm sort of shifting gears.
So is this going to apply to any, I mean, even if you're a US-based company, you have no operations in Europe, and you don't target any European customers, but you have European citizens that happen upon your website for one reason or another, this law would apply?
This law would apply with respect to your processing of the data of those European residents, unless you, for example, took affirmative steps to try to prevent that processing. In other words, you mentioned not targeting folks in Europe, and that could be one major thing that helps you avoid compliance. But to really avoid compliance, you'd have to basically say, do things again like geofencing, or affirmatively say you're not doing business with, this is a product or service that's only available to people in the US, et cetera. You'd have to really make it clear that you don't want to touch Europe at all.